On the 25th of October, 1415, an English army stood in a narrow field near a small village called Azincourt in northern France. It was exhausted. It was hungry. A large part of it was sick. Behind that army lay weeks of marching, a brutal siege, and an outbreak of disease that had already killed more soldiers than combat would that day. In front of it stood a French force that was larger by how much, historians still argue, but larger by any measure, made up of experienced nobles, seasoned knights, and men who believed, with good reason, that this battle was already won. Here's the key thing. By almost every standard of medieval warfare, the English army at Agincourt should have lost. It was smaller. It was in worse physical condition. It was fighting far from home, with no realistic route of retreat. And yet, within a few hours, it inflicted one of the most lopsided defeats in the history of the 100 Years' War. The English longbow usually gets the credit for this, and the longbow mattered genuinely, significantly. But a bow, however powerful, doesn't explain how a smaller, sicker army destroyed a larger one almost entirely intact on the other side. So, here's the real question worth asking. How does an army, this exhausted, this outnumbered, this apparently doomed, win one of the most famous battles in English history? To understand Agincourt, you have to understand why Henry V was in France at all. England and France had been fighting on and off since 1337, a conflict historians later named the 100 Years' War. At its core was a dynastic dispute. English kings, going back to Edward III, claimed they had a legitimate right to the French crown itself, through a female line the French rejected under their own succession law. Henry inherited that claim in 1413. He also inherited something more fragile, a Lancastrian monarchy, still finding its footing, built on the back of his father's usurpation of Richard II just 14 years earlier. A foreign war, won decisively, was exactly the kind of thing that could unite a divided English nobility behind a new king. Before invading, Henry made demands of the French crown that were, by most historical assessments, close to impossible to accept vast territories across western France, along with a massive dowry attached to marriage with the French princess Catherine of Valois. This wasn't necessarily a serious opening offer. It was a pretext, deliberately built to be rejected, giving Henry legal and moral justification for war. This matters because Agincourt wasn't some isolated skirmish. It was one battle inside a much larger, generations-long struggle over the French throne itself. A struggle that had already devastated both kingdoms for decades before Henry ever set sail. In August 1415, he landed in Normandy with an invasion force. His first target, the fortified port town of Harfleur. Henry expected Harfleur to fall quickly. It didn't. The siege dragged on for roughly 5 weeks, far longer than planned, as the town's garrison held out behind strong fortifications. And while the English army sat outside those walls, a much deadlier enemy went to work inside their own camp: dysentery. The disease tore through the English ranks. Soldiers died by the hundreds. Others were so weakened they had to be shipped home. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered in late September, Henry's army had already lost a significant portion of its fighting strength, not to French swords, but to sickness. Here's what the popular version of this story usually skips. Henry now faced a decision. Sail home with a captured port and call it a campaign, or push on and make a statement. He chose to march his weakened army roughly 100 miles north toward the English-held town of Calais, partly as a show of strength, partly, historians suggest, because retreating quietly after so much cost would have looked like failure. That march was meant to take about a week. It didn't. French forces broke the crossings along the River Somme, forcing Henry's already depleted, already sick army into a long detour south before they finally found an unguarded ford near Azincourt in mid-October. This wasn't a well-supplied army closing in for an easy fight. This was a force running out of food, marching through hostile territory, its numbers thinned by disease before a single arrow had been fired. By the time English scouts spotted the gathering French army blocking the road ahead near the village of Azincourt, Henry's men had been marching, starving and dying of illness for weeks. Drama. Medieval chroniclers on both sides routinely inflated enemy numbers, sometimes wildly. Some contemporary French and English accounts claimed the French army numbered anywhere from 20,000 to well over 60,000 men. Most modern historians reject the higher end of that range as simply implausible for a force gathered on short notice. More conservative modern estimates, built from surviving pay records and muster rolls, suggest something closer to 12 to 30,000 French troops against an English force somewhere around 6 to 9,000. Some historians, most notably Anne Curry, have argued the true gap may have been considerably smaller than tradition claims, perhaps closer to 2 to 1 rather than 4 to 1 or higher. Other historians disagree and maintain a wider gap. The honest answer is that we don't know the exact figures and probably never will. What we do know is this: the French had more men, and the French had a serious problem the numbers alone don't capture. Command was divided. The official military leadership, Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Jean Boucicaut, held formal authority, but the army was packed with powerful royal dukes and counts, men of higher social rank than the officers technically in charge, all eager for the glory of leading the assault themselves. King Charles VI, who suffered recurring episodes of mental illness, was not present. Neither was the Dauphin. The French Royal Council had decided, deliberately, to keep them away from the fighting, which meant there was no single unquestioned authority on the field the way Henry commanded his own army. This matters because having more soldiers is not the same thing as being able to control them. A large army with a fractured command structure can move slower, argue longer, and coordinate worse than a smaller one with a single voice in charge. The French believed they had already won this battle before it started. What they hadn't accounted for was the ground they were about to fight on. The armies met in open farmland near Azincourt, bordered on both sides by dense woodland tramcourt wood on one flank, Agincourt wood on the other. Those two tree lines weren't just scenery. They acted like the walls of a funnel, narrowing the usable battlefield to a relatively tight corridor between them. This mattered enormously. A larger army wants room to spread out, to use its numbers to wrap around a smaller enemy from the sides. The woods on either flank made that almost impossible here. The French couldn't simply overwhelm the English line by outflanking it. The terrain itself blocked the maneuver. Then add the weather. Recent rain had soaked the recently plowed field into heavy, clinging mud, the kind that grips boots, drags down armor, and turns a short march into an exhausting slog. Here's what this meant in practice. As thousands of heavily armored men began advancing across that ground, the mud didn't just slow them down, it began to actively work against them, turning open field into a churned, treacherous swamp with every step. A smaller army, defending a narrow corridor, on ground that punished heavy movement, had turned raw numerical disadvantage into something closer to an even fight before either side had thrown a single weapon. This is where the archers come in, and here's where the legend needs some careful correcting. The English longbow was a genuinely formidable weapon, made from yew, drawn with tremendous force, likely somewhere in the range of 80 to over 150 pounds of draw weight, based on surviving comparable bows from the period. Pulling one required years of practice, often beginning in childhood. England had laws requiring regular archery training precisely because the skill took so long to develop. A trained archer could loose perhaps 6 to 12 arrows a minute in short bursts. Multiply that by several thousand archers, firing in coordinated volleys, and you get something close to a continuous storm of arrows falling across the battlefield. But here's what the legend completely ignores. Well-made plate armor, the kind worn by French men-at-arms and nobility, could often resist a direct hit from distance. Arrows did not simply punch through breastplates on contact, no matter how dramatic that image is. What arrows were devastatingly good at was something different. Disruption. They killed and maimed horses, causing terrified animals to rear, bolt, and crash back into their own advancing ranks. They found the gap's visor slits, joints, less protected limbs, the flanks of a mount. They forced men to lower their heads and narrow their vision at exactly the moment they needed to see clearly. They fell in such volume that soldiers instinctively bunched together and edged toward the center of the advance to escape the fire from both flanks, which, on already narrow, muddy ground, only made the crowding worse. This is the point worth sitting with. The longbow's greatest weapon wasn't simply penetration. It was disruption chaos, fear, and crowding inflicted from a distance before the two armies ever met in close combat. One more crucial detail the popular story often leaves out: the stakes. Henry had ordered his archers to carry sharpened wooden stakes, roughly 6 feet long, and plant them at an angle in front of their positions, a deliberate defense against exactly the kind of cavalry charge the French were expected to launch. Without that innovation, a determined mounted charge might have ridden the archers down before they ever mattered. The longbow didn't win this battle by itself. It won as part of a system terrain, stakes, formation, and disciplined, sustained volleys working together. Did French knights actually mock the English longbow before Agincourt? The popular version of this story is vivid. Proud French nobility, contemptuous of a peasant weapon, confident that armored chivalry would simply ride down a rabble of English bowmen. The reality is more complicated. Several near-contemporary chronicles, English accounts in particular, including the anonymous Gesta Henrici Quinte, likely written by a chaplain present with Henry's army, to describe overwhelming French confidence before the battle and open contempt for the condition of the English force. Exhausted, diseased, heavily outnumbered, and largely composed of common-born archers rather than mounted nobility. That contempt was real, and it was rooted partly in class. Medieval chivalric culture placed enormous prestige on the mounted armored knight and correspondingly little on the common archer, regardless of how dangerous that archer's weapon actually was. But a specific, verifiable quotation, French lords directly mocking the longbow itself as a weapon, is much harder to pin down in the primary sources. What survives looks more like general overconfidence and social disdain for the English army as a whole, later compressed by storytellers into one clean, dramatic line about mocking the bow specifically. There's a related legend worth mentioning here too, because it often gets tangled up with this one. The popular story that French soldiers threatened to cut off the drawing fingers of captured English archers, supposedly the origin of the defiant two-finger gesture still used in Britain today. It's a great story. It also has essentially no solid evidence in medieval sources. Most historians treat it as a much later invention, likely no older than the 20th century. So what's the honest answer? French overconfidence before Agincourt is well documented. Specific mockery of the longbow as a weapon is a dramatic simplification of that broader contempt, not a confirmed historical quotation. The battle opened with French mounted attacks aimed at the flanks of the English line, where the archers were positioned. It did not go the way the French had planned. The ground was already heavy with mud. The charge had to cross open space under sustained arrow fire the entire way. And when the horsemen reached the English flanks, they ran directly into Henry's planted stakes, a defense many French commanders apparently hadn't fully anticipated. Wounded and panicked horses reared, threw their riders, and bolted back the way they'd come, directly into the French infantry now advancing behind them. This wasn't a complete rout in the first minutes. Some cavalry did reach the English line and inflicted real casualties before being driven back. But the charge failed in its central purpose. It did not break the archers, and it did not clear a path for the infantry advance that was supposed to follow behind it. What it did do was start the chaos that was about to consume the entire French assault. The main French infantry advance began on foot, Thousands of heavily armored men-at-arms moving forward into that narrow corridor between the woods. And here's where the numerical advantage the French had counted on became something closer to a curse. The battlefield, remember, was narrow. As the French tried to bring their full strength to bear, ranks that should have had room to maneuver were forced shoulder to shoulder, tighter and tighter, simply because there wasn't enough open ground to hold them all. Then the mud went to work. Men in 60 or more pounds of armor, already exhausted from the march to reach the field, sank ankle and shin deep with every stride. Advancing became gruelling. Simply staying upright became a fight in itself. Arrows fell continuously from both flanks. And here's the key effect, not primarily killing outright, but pushing frightened, crowded men further toward the center of their own formation, away from the archers, tightening the crush even more. This is the part of the Agincourt legend that's usually simplified into a single image of arrows raining death. The real killer was the crowd itself. Men in the front ranks were struck down or simply lost their footing in the mud, and the press of thousands of men behind them, still pushing forward, meant there was often no way to recover. Soldiers fell and were trampled by their own advancing comrades. Bodies began piling up, and later ranks had to physically climb or clamber over the fallen just to keep moving forward. Here's the contrast worth remembering. The French were not defeated because they lacked courage. Multiple accounts describe desperate, sustained fighting once the lines finally met. They were defeated because courage could not create space, and space was the one thing that narrow, muddy corridor refused to give them. The English line, by contrast, fought in a formation that had room to function, protected on its flanks, its archers free to keep shooting into the packed mass in front of them, and, increasingly, to drop their bows and wade into the crush with hand weapons against French soldiers too exhausted and too crowded to properly defend themselves. The French numerical advantage, the thing that was supposed to guarantee victory, had become the exact mechanism of their own destruction. Henry himself fought in the thick of this collapse, not from a safe distance behind the lines. His helmet, sources indicate, took a direct blow during the fighting damage significant enough that it's referenced in later accounts of the battle. His younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was wounded nearby, and chroniclers describe Henry standing to defend him in the chaos around the royal position. Why does this matter? In medieval warfare, a king fighting visibly among his own men wasn't just personal bravery, it was tactically important. Soldiers took their cue from the banners and the figures they could see. If Henry had fallen, or simply vanished from view, English cohesion in that crushing, chaotic melee could have collapsed entirely. His survival and his visible presence at the center of the fighting helped hold the English line together at the exact moment the battle was being decided. By this point in the battle, the English had taken a large number of French prisoners, men of rank worth substantial ransoms, the kind of prize that could make a common soldier wealthy. Then came one of the most debated moments of the entire day. Reports reached Henry of what looked like a fresh French threat, possibly a rallying 3rd Division, possibly an attack on the poorly defended English baggage train behind the lines. Whatever the exact trigger, Henry gave an order that has troubled historians for 600 years. Kill the prisoners. Why? The most commonly accepted explanation is grimly practical. The English were already outnumbered by their own captives. If a renewed French assault materialized while so many soldiers were tied up guarding prisoners instead of fighting, the army guarding the field could have been overwhelmed from within. That doesn't make it comfortable. Under the chivalric conventions of the time, killing surrendered, ransomable prisoners was considered deeply dishonorable, and some chroniclers suggest many English soldiers refused the order, forcing Henry to assign specific men to carry it out. This wasn't the act of a flawless storybook hero. It also wasn't the act of a simple, mindless butcher. It was a brutal, calculated decision, made under real pressure in a battle where the line between victory and disaster hadn't yet been settled. Agincourt was a major English triumph. It was also, in this moment, a genuinely dark one. So how one-sided was the actual outcome? Medieval casualty figures are notoriously unreliable, and Agincourt is no exception. Chroniclers on both sides had reasons to shape the numbers, English writers to magnify the miracle, French writers to explain away the disaster. Most modern historians agree French losses were severe, likely numbering in the thousands, and strikingly heavy among the high nobility. Multiple dukes and senior commanders, including Constable d'Albret himself, were killed. English losses, by contrast, are recorded in several sources as remarkably low, sometimes cited in the low hundreds, though historians caution that figure may be an undercount, particularly of common soldiers whose deaths were less likely to be individually recorded than those of English nobles. The precise numbers will probably never be settled. What isn't disputed is the scale of the imbalance. Whatever the exact figures, one army walked away from that field largely intact. The other did not. Pull all of this together, and the French defeat at Agincourt stops looking like a simple story about Longbow's beating armor. The battlefield was too narrow to use their numbers properly. Days of rain had turned the ground into a trap for heavily armored infantry. Command was divided among rival nobles instead of unified under one clear authority. The opening cavalry charge failed against stakes and mud before it ever reached full force. Arrows falling from both flanks pushed the advancing infantry into an ever tighter crush. And once the French front ranks began to fall, their own numbers pressing forward from behind made recovery almost impossible. This wasn't simply Longbow beats armor. This was a combined failure of terrain management, of command structure, of tactical adaptation, with the longbow acting as the catalyst that turned every other French disadvantage into a catastrophe. Numerical superiority on that particular field, on that particular day, became a liability rather than a strength. Agincourt transformed Henry V's reputation almost overnight. A king whose legitimacy had been genuinely uncertain returned home as a conquering hero. His political position at home dramatically strengthened. That prestige translated into real gains. 5 years later, in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes recognized Henry as heir to the French throne itself, sidelining the Dauphin, and sealed the arrangement with his marriage to Catherine of Valois. Here's what the legend often glosses over, though. Agincourt did not end the 100 Years' War. Henry died in 1422, before he could ever actually claim the French crown he'd been promised, and the war ground on for decades afterward, eventually turning decisively against England, most famously during the campaigns associated with Joan of Arc. But the battle's place in English national memory only grew over time, reaching its most famous form nearly 2 centuries later in Shakespeare's retelling and the St. Crispin's Day speech that cemented the Band of Brothers image, still attached to Agincourt today. The longbow became a national symbol partly because of what actually happened on that muddy field, and partly because English memory needed a clean, heroic story more than it needed a complicated one. So where does this leave the legend? The French did not lose Agincourt because they were cowards. Multiple accounts describe fierce, sustained fighting once the lines finally collided. The English did not win because arrows magically punched through every piece of French armor on the field. That version flatters the weapon at the expense of the truth. Henry V won because he combined discipline, terrain, defensive preparation, and a weapon capable of creating sustained disruption, and because his opponents, for all their courage and experience, walked into a narrow, muddy corridor with a divided command and a plan that fell apart under conditions nobody had fully accounted for. The exact number of arrows loosed that day, and whether they truly blotted out the sun, isn't something any surviving chronicle actually confirms. It's a dramatic phrase that has attached itself to Agincourt over centuries of retelling closer to poetry than to a documented fact. But the arrows still mattered. They wounded horses, disrupted formations, and helped turn a French advance into a crush no army could fight its way out of. The arrows mattered. But the real weapon was the trap Henry built around them. So here's the question worth leaving you with. Was Agincourt the greatest triumph of the English longbow, or one of history's clearest examples of an army destroying itself through bad ground, bad timing, and bad command? Let me know what you think in the comments.